Let's hope, and we're live. Hi there, everyone. My name is Sam Williams, and I'm the creator of Accelerate. Today, continuing on the adaptive leadership sessions that we've been doing, I've got with me Drew McCarthy, who you would have seen before, and a new guest, Thomas Patterson. Drew, say hi to the audience.
Hello, I'm back again, and yes, excited to continue these discussions around the uncertainty we've been presented with in 2020.
And Thomas, why don't you introduce yourself? I believe that you're something of you're marooned in the island of Toronto at the moment.
Yeah, so my name's Thomas Patterson. At the moment, I'm a freelance content strategist. So I am a Kiwi who's based in Toronto now, and yeah, we'll get into a little bit about my story and kind of what my situation is at the moment, but good to be here today and ready for the discussion.
Great. And so Nate, if you could put up the graphic that we were wanting to discuss to begin with. I just wanted to talk to everyone about, how long is this likely to go on for? So it's actually one of the things around a pandemic is getting some perspective on what's going on. I guess for those of us that have been in lockdown, we're getting quite a different sense of time, and there's the sense that's developing of, can't this just be over now? If we look at the history of pandemics, it's interesting to note that the bubonic plague or the Black Death of the 1300s killed 200 million people. Something that's a little bit closer to home in terms of time is the HIV/AIDS pandemic. And it's really interesting to note, at least to me, that between 25 and 35 million people being killed over what is nearly a 40-year period. And today, still, there is no vaccine for HIV/AIDS. The reason why I wanted to share this graphic was really this idea of how long is this going to go on for? And when you look back at history, the average life of a pandemic is at least 2 years in duration. So the H1N1 flu, or the Spanish flu as we commonly know it, took place over a 2-year period. It was from 1918 to 1919, and there were multiple waves of it, as I'm sure many of you have become familiar with. So this expectation that we have that things are now getting back to normal, or we just need to get back to work, are perhaps misguided in the context of history. So I guess with that in mind, we've got a couple of people here who are in situations that, Drew, for instance, as we've described him, a coronavirus refugee, someone that had managed to come back from China and has essentially become marooned or a refugee of the pandemic in a country now, being New Zealand, that the virus has been eradicated from, and things in this country are back to normal. Yet the rest of the world continues to be in the midst of this massive pandemic. So, Drew, I guess this is a good point to start talking about, what's developed for you, and what are your expectations about getting back to whatever the new normal may be.
Yeah, it has certainly been an interesting way to chart the year. I think I've mentioned previously that my trip back to New Zealand was meant to be 6 days, and it's now ended up being just about 5 months, with no real end in sight. And I think that it's that uncertainty that is what we've continued to discuss around being the most difficult part of dealing with all this. There's a lot of different things that have to change or improve in terms of COVID for me to be able to get back to the 90% of my belongings that are still sitting in an apartment in Shanghai, and the office that I'm meant to be working out of in Shanghai, and all the kind of the little lifestyle things that were slowly I was getting set up after having moved back to China. And so now it's, I guess there's been a lot of discussion around whether or not to, make a set plan in place for staying in New Zealand longer term, finding, living, it's kind of quite an appealing choice to get a car in Auckland because our public transport isn't necessarily the easiest way to get around the city, and all those little decisions that I wasn't expecting to have to make this year off the back of being in New Zealand. So yeah, I think there's a kind of a hopefulness that by the end of the year we'll be able to move a bit more freely, and I might be back in China by that point, or we can start making some plans for holidays or things along that line. But it's a kind of hope, pragmatism that as those stats suggest, we really could be in this for a much longer time than I think a lot of people are thinking, especially in New Zealand, where as soon as we hit our level 1 lockdown, opening up of restrictions earlier this week, a lot of people were saying, "Oh, we've beaten it. That's it. We're back to normal," which just absolutely is not the case, and will not be the case for a long time, given the rest of the world is deep in the throes of dealing with this in a much more severe way than we've had to. So I guess, sorry, what were you going to ask?
Oh, well, and I guess there was an example that I heard you cite around visa offices not necessarily being open. So, it's not just the simple logistics of getting from A to B, it's actually the access to the countries as well.
Exactly.
I think you were saying something about.
So it was essentially off the back of China first dealing with the big outbreak from Wuhan. A huge number of people streamed back into the country, and they got a lot of imported cases because of that. Subsequently, they shut their borders to any non-citizens. So I have a valid residency and working visa for China, but I can't get back into the country using those documents. So for me to get back into the country, I either have to get a new visa issued, which, as you've said, the visa offices aren't issuing new visas, or they're issuing them at a much lower rate than they normally do, to restrict that travel, or I wait until the borders open again, which there isn't a lot of information about when that might be.
And so, Thomas, tell us a little bit about your situation in Toronto.
Yeah, kind of similar to what Drew's just talked through about visas and uncertainty. So, I moved over to Toronto with my partner about 2 years ago, and kind of thinking back to the beginning of this year, our initial plan was to see our 2-year work visa through to its end, and then move from Toronto over to London, UK. And so we were pretty much set on, this would be our last few months in Toronto, and then hopefully everything going well, moving over to London. And then when the pandemic kind of first started breaking out, this was probably early March, we were just keeping an eye on it, seeing, maybe this might affect things. We weren't sure how much it would affect things. And then I think it was by mid to late March, Toronto and Canada had gone into lockdown. And so we started looking at what our options were in terms of visas and immigration, and whether that was trying to stay in Canada a bit longer, or if it was still possible to even go to the UK at the moment. So yeah, that kind of threw a spanner in the works about just what we could do and what our options were. And the longer it went on, we found out that Canada immigration had basically said that our visa type couldn't be extended, and that they also wouldn't be issuing any new visas for our visa type over here. And then in terms of the process to get a UK visa, we needed to go to a visa application center, and because of the lockdown, those had also closed down, which meant that we couldn't go forward with any of those visa processes. So yeah, everything from having our set plan at the beginning of the year of what, best case scenario would be, it kind of then became scrambling around to see what was possible, where we could be, where could we potentially go back to in New Zealand if that was something we wanted to do. And then I guess in the middle of this all, I got let go from my job. And so that kind of added another element of uncertainty to what it was over here. And yeah, I guess after that, we did consider going home. But as Drew kind of mentioned, we're hoping for things opening up and travel between Canada and the rest of the world, and Canada and the UK opening up a bit more. So I think if we'd gone back to New Zealand, it just would have made it a bit harder to get back to this side of the world. So yeah, at the moment, it's more a bit of a waiting game to see if these application centers open up, and then personally myself, just kind of pivoting what I do as a job from going from a role within a marketing team over here in Canada to basically working as a freelancer now and working as a contractor, and kind of exploring that option as well. So yeah, not sure where we'll be kind of 3-6 months from now, but basically a waiting game and seeing how things evolve from here.
Yeah, so I guess each person's in a bit of a different situation, and I guess this is one of the things that we probably don't think about is, there's a whole group of the population in any given country that is on some sort of overseas experience. There's a group of immigrants in every country or immigrant workers is probably a better way of putting it, that have been thrust into a completely uncertain situation. I was hearing about people from the Pacific Islands, Vanuatu in particular. They're stranded here. They're seasonal workers that come here for the fruit picking season. There's another group of thousands that are agricultural workers from Europe and elsewhere in the world that are stuck here too, and they're having to rely on state aid effectively simply to eat. So we're starting to see camps emerge to take care of immigrant populations. So it's not just as simple as whether you can get a visa to work somewhere. It's transport networks not being open. It's whether or not countries will, even citizens, have challenges in terms of just the logistics of getting back to their own countries. I guess with that in mind, we wanted to talk a little bit about what's happening in terms of work. Drew, you've got some thoughts to share in terms of what you've seen in, was it New Zealand or China?
Yeah, so the stats, I've got a slide with some stats on it around people's ability to survive off their savings. This is from New Zealand. And it's really interesting to note that essentially 40% of the population here have got around a month's worth of time to play with if they were to lose their income. And I think it's really important to see how we can start to help these people that are potentially, at risk of losing their employment and can't survive for very long without an income. I think to sort of touch on the point you had around immigrant workers being stuck in New Zealand, we've also got the counter problem of a lot of the migrant workers that the New Zealand economy relies on are currently locked out of New Zealand. And so there's a big job that has to be done around finding domestic replacements for that work. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity, hopefully, for Kiwis to take on some of those jobs. And there are the usual sort of problems around geographic mobility and all those kind of things. But yeah, hopefully we can make up for the shortfall in migrant workers with domestic replacements. There's certainly a lot of areas that all the employees seem to be, from the overseas, which is great and testament to New Zealand being a place that people like to come and work for short, medium, long term. But the reality is that those roles need to be filled with Kiwi boots in the sort of short to medium term.
Yeah, I think this is something that I was discussing yesterday in a session that I was doing across ANZ, that when people talk about supply chains, they tend to think in terms of goods and manufacturing, but there is a talent supply chain that has now been interrupted. So it could be something as simple as you were relying on a particular person to turn up in a place to record something or present something that's just not on offer, and it's also down to a state level. So in Australia, for instance, you can't move between Western Australia and Victoria, or New South Wales and Queensland. So in terms of our labour supply chain, where you had taken for granted the fact that people can move within a country easily to be, or from places overseas, your supply chain for talent is severely disrupted here. So with that in mind, Thomas, tell us a little bit about life in Toronto and what you were experiencing from a contrasting kind of point of view to New Zealand now.
Yeah, it's been interesting because in terms of different geographics and different experiences based on where you are. And so when this was first happening, we were coming out of winter, and because Canada's so known for its harsh winters, basically in Toronto, as soon as the weather starts warming up, that's when everyone just wants to get outside or go to restaurants, go to bars. And so what happened here was that we were starting to come out of winter, but everything was closed and there was nothing for people to do. So I've actually got a couple images here, if we can bring those up, which basically goes through what happens when people who are stuck inside, as the weather gets better, it kind of drives them to go outside. And in Toronto, living downtown, a lot of people live in small apartments with no backyards. So what was actually allowed by the Ontario province was people could go outside, but they had to stay socially distanced. So 2 meters away from each other is what you should have been doing. And then basically the first weekend that it was nice weather outside, we had this image on the left where everyone was out there. No one was following the rules. There was a lot of backlash about, obviously there's a lot of younger people in these crowds. So a lot of backlash saying that, the younger generation doesn't care at all. And then what happened was the Toronto government basically put in these socially distancing circles to make sure that people stayed within their barriers and stayed distanced from each other. I think that's it's an interesting point of looking forward to what life will be like. I know we're not out of it here in Toronto, and it's just going to be for the foreseeable future, life with these restrictions, and that's going to be, how you can go to the park every day. And if we go to my next slide, I've got a few headlines that have recently been coming out of the news over here of just what life could look like going forward. So we're saying, health professionals are saying that everyone should be wearing face masks from now on. There's going to be rules about what you can do at the beach, who can go to the beach, and then in terms of events and sports games, that's really off the cards for the rest of 2020, possibly into 2021. So yeah, in terms of what life will look like going forward, it's going to be filled with restrictions. And I know you mentioned, Sam, before how in New Zealand you're in level 1 now, and so there is kind of that optimism that we're coming out of it. But yeah, watching that from over here where we're still very much in the thick of it, and in terms of what life will look like going forward, it'll be a lot different than what we were experiencing last summer.
Yeah, it's fascinating to look at some of the data from the 1918 influenza pandemic and seeing how different responses in different states and different countries were different in terms of social distancing practices, and how their mortality rates were quite different in terms of spikes and second waves. So I guess that's another thing that's kind of going to be a challenge, as well as people's complacency. So the example that you showed, Thomas, of the circles and how then everybody just ignored them, that complacency in terms of the need for social distancing, would have meant that the lockdowns will continue longer, because infection would have been passed, or the virus would have been transmitted in those situations potentially. So culture, and I guess one way of putting it is conformity, is a key to combating a public health emergency like this. And it is very interesting to contrast what happened in China and Wuhan, where there was what we would have considered in the West a draconian lockdown, but how short and sharp was that in comparison to what we're seeing elsewhere in the world? Maybe Drew, you some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think just to touch on how bad the timing of this was, given that it all started to explode right before Chinese New Year, which is the largest migration of the population in the world. I think there 600 million to a billion people move around in late January, early February. And so I think the severity of the lockdown in Wuhan was partly a response to that. That so many people had taken this disease all over the country, and to really try and crack down in the hub of it in Wuhan, it was just a blanket ban that you couldn't go out, and having a couple of friends that live in Wuhan, it really was, you couldn't leave your apartment for a long time, 4 to 6 weeks, I think it ended up being, if not slightly longer. But in many ways, it really helped show, I think, that the virus could be stopped, and there was, regardless of the response, whether it was timely enough, I think it is an important sort of first precedent to set for the rest of the world, that by shutting down and by cutting off the the vectors for transmission, the virus could be stopped, within 2 to 3 months. And yes, subsequently has accelerated again, but I think it was, hopefully a bit of a win in terms of the kind of social consciousness around making people feel like they should be playing by the rules to stop the spread.
Yeah, I guess the cultural dimension to this is probably one that's becoming more and more apparent. Like the duration of the pandemic actually comes down to human behavior in terms of preventing the transmission. So there was a cultural dimension in what you were talking about in relation to Chinese New Year, and there was a similar dynamic when it came to the influenza pandemic. You had a world war that was going on, and a lot of people from all over the world coming together, to fight battles or be trained. So this cultural dimension is a particularly important one. Just from a last comment standpoint, Thomas, was there anything that you thought relevant to add?
Yeah, one other thing I just wanted to briefly touch on was what's been interesting being over here in Canada is seeing kind of the information and misinformation of what is spread with everyone. So within Canada, you have different provinces, and then different provinces have their own governments. So Ontario, where Toronto is one of the bigger provinces, and then we've got Toronto and the Greater Toronto Area, which itself probably has about 8 million people. And then we've got the regions throughout Ontario. And I think what's been interesting when you compare it to New Zealand is that, yes, New Zealand is a smaller place, so it was easier to be contained. But I think just the simplicity with how they were able to communicate with the public was really important. So over here, we've had sort of the Premier of Ontario giving us information, the Mayor of Toronto giving us information, and then you've got Prime Minister Trudeau, who's also giving us information. And I think, it's almost been information overload where everyone just doesn't know what is the situation for what they're going through. And even in Toronto, it's, you see in the regions, they're not as badly affected as the city of Toronto. And so, it's interesting to see how maybe looking back, it could have been simplified a bit more in terms of how things are communicated. But yeah, there was an interesting comparison I saw with regards to between Canada and New Zealand and how the public has responded to what they've been told.
Okay, great. This is one of our longer sessions, so thanks guys for participating. And if you're interested to learn more, please like, share, comment, and there are other sessions that we'll have coming up and other material that we'll be publishing. Look at the comments below or the sections below the video to find out other places you can find out more. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.